Can a witch be a wizard and a wizard be a witch?
Welcome to Witch and Wizard and Worlds Within. We will see. Maybe we will find out with you, Julian.
I'll do my best to explore that conversation with the two of you. Bernhard and Stephanie, thank you very much for inviting me on the show. It's most appreciated.
Julian Vayne, it's an honor to have you here. We know each other since several years now. It's always great to talk with you. And I thought for this conversation, who would be better suited than you? Because you are a witch, you're a magician, you're a mason. Thelema is a big part of your magical journey. So you integrate so many traditions within yourself, so many worldviews. Chaos magic, of course. You're an author, speaker. So speak to us.
I mean, when you wrote to me and you said, the question is, what's the difference between a witch and a wizard, or what's the relationship between these things? And I thought about this for a while. There's a book by Gerald Gardner, which was published just before the Witchcraft Act was repealed in the British Isles, called High Magic's Aid. And High Magic's Aid is a story of a witch and a wizard, or magician, I believe is called in the book. And part of what Gardner is exploring in that book is exploring what is this relationship. And I suppose we have to think about, you know, historically, when are we talking about the use of these words and by what communities, you know? But for me, when I think about these things, when I think about witchcraft, for me, it has a certain flavor. So there's the flavor, and the flavor is night and moonlight, and it's feminine, and you meet in a circle, and it's about like the deep, and it's about the kind of ancestry, and it has a certain kind of vibe about it, you know? And I would say words like sorcerer, like magician, like wizard, and so on, they have a slightly different flavor. Wizard in my head is always like adjacent to Dungeons and Dragons, because that's what magicians were called in Dungeons and Dragons, you know? So a wizard is, we know it's a word meaning a wise person, a sage, a philosopher. It's come to mean a magic user. Sorcery has maybe, again, that kind, it has a kind of flavor to it, which suggests, again, the sort of the mysterious thing. If I had to write it on a continuum, I think sorcery is closer to witch and wizard is closer to magician, I think, in my head at the moment. And maybe that will change next Tuesday, I don't know. But I would say that the relationship is one where it's like talking about styles of music. You know, we can talk about, these are all forms of engaging with the magical, the spiritual. But the way that opera engages with the domain of music, and the way that black metal engages with it, are very different. And yet, of course, there are huge similarities between these two things. You know, they can be operatic, they can be dramatic, they can be, you know, they can talk about big stories and so on. So I think that it's more about like a relationship than a differentiation. It's more like a spectrum than it is like two discrete compartments in which we can place things. I suppose part of it is that typically magicians have been identified as male. If we look at the tarot and we see the first two great magic users in the tarot, we have the Fool, who's this kind of androgynous character who links all the stuff together. Crowley describes it in the Book of Thoth as the most complex of all of the cards. And then we have this kind of fundamental gendered polarity, or apparently gendered polarity, of what is often represented as a male magician, and then the priestess, who in my head has a kind of, particularly having worked, you know, my growing up into magic was through my encounter with neo-pagan witchcraft, with Wicca. And so for me, when I see the priestess or the high priestess, I immediately think of that style of ritual. So I guess that's kind of how I had my first thoughts about it. I don't know if that gets us anywhere useful.
Absolutely. I think I love the comparison to music, because that's how I always try to describe magic in itself. So there are so many different styles, genres, developments, and I never thought of it to compare these different approaches um, in magic. I don't like this high or low magic distinction, but the spectrum, I like that very much.
I think also it's interesting when we look at any of these. I mean, we have these word compartments for things. We have these words, you know, wizard and magician and so on. But also, I think that for me, I mean, my part of my kind of part of my sort of training, I suppose, is as a kind of historian and someone who works in museums and galleries and so on. And one of the things I always think is really interesting is that we often look at things, we say, oh, this is how it is. And actually what we need to understand often is, and how was it 10 years ago and 100 years ago and 500 years ago? You know, like if you look at even the word magic, the definitions and the understanding of what that means. Is magic process which is about a kind of transcendental reaching up towards some kind of divine being and becoming kind of one with that? Or is magic basically a set of like cheat codes for the universe to get you what you want? Like, and it's all of those things.
Yeah.
It's all of those things. And it depends on who you talk to and when you talk to them and the cultural situation that they're in as to the answer that you'll get for these kinds of things. So I think that for me, in terms of my own kind of identity, I often actually pick another word. I often say that I'm an occultist. So I'm someone who is interested in that which is hidden.
Yes.
And I'm interested in the practice of exploring that which is hidden. So it's a practice. It's a process of doing. And I kind of like the word occultist because it looks really cool if you write it down. You know, it has lots of. I also have a background as a graphic designer and a typographer, so I like lettering. So I look at I go, oh, that's a very cool word, and it suggests the hiddenness of this. Wizard, like I say, in my head is always a Dungeons and Dragons word, but I like the idea of like wisdom. I like the idea of like sorcery is an interesting word with its suggestion of both divination and the manipulation of fate, the manipulation of possibility, which, of course, historically has mostly meant bad magic user, someone who uses magic for malefic or dangerous reasons. You know, when we talk about witch bottles or plants that are associated with witchcraft, or the witch marks that are sometimes found on doorways into buildings, old buildings. These are witch in the sense of the witch is something you don't want. The witch is something that you want to remove and get rid of and prevent from coming into your space. And of course, that word in the modern age, ever since really the Romantic period, you know, sort of 1700s, 1800s, and massively in the 20th century, the word itself has been reimagined as a word of neo-pagan sensibility, female empowerment, the idea of looking to those peoples and situations that have been oppressed in the past and trying to see whether or not there were good things in there or things that we might at least learn from. So I think witch is particularly interesting because it's a word that was used to give license to kill people, very often people who were not in any sense witches or magical practitioners. They were just the unfortunate individuals who ended up in those circumstances being accused. But I think that the way that that word has changed to become a word of particularly empowerment for, and again, this is why it has a flavor for me of women. It's like it's very much, you know, if you look at the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, which was an American women's rights pressure group who did some of the first actions against things like beauty pageants and stuff like this, you know, really important group. So they use the image of the witch to make political changes to benefit women and therefore everybody else in culture as well. So I think witch is a particularly interesting word because it's gone through this big transformation. And then, you know, other words like magician. Magician is particularly interesting because it's a very uncertain word. You know, it's a word that both suggests, you know, Siegfried and Roy doing their kind of, you know, conjuring tricks. And it's also a word that suggests this really ancient lineage going all the way back to Persia of the cultivation of an understanding of the secret patterns of the world, and perhaps then the ability to shape and to change those things. Yeah, that's a few thoughts. I'll stop now.
I could throw in the cunning man or the conjurer, as you said, and so on, and the witch doctor. So there are so many. Stephanie, do you find yourself on this spectrum?
Yes, on the whole spectrum, I would say. I like your definition of that flavor, Julian. It's, for me, it's not what you practice, it's how you practice it, and for whom you practice. That makes the difference between witches and magicians, or magic on this whole spectrum. And I find myself not in that bad woman that curses and yeah, such things. But the word witch is definitely that one that represents what I do, or that resonates with myself. Yeah, maybe it's my flavor. Yes, I like that description or that definition.
And you, Julian, you would use the whole spectrum, walking from one end to the other, as your mood takes you, or as the work that is in front of you demands it? Or...
Yeah, I mean, for me, part of the reason, like you said, I've been very, very fortunate in my practice. I've had the opportunity to do ceremony with lots of different fabulous people. And, you know, so part of my wide-ranging interest is because I have met such good people, some of whom will describe themselves, hey, I'm a druid, or I'm a thelemite, or I'm a whatever. And the things I think that, in my experience, important to understand is that these are convenient terms that we use. But actually, if you look at the personnel, the people involved, often you find, well, you know, here's this druid person who but they're in a context where they're doing something that looks very much like, quote, chaos magic. And here are these chaos magicians who are doing what looks like witchcraft. I mean, I know these things are true because I've been, you know, hung out in those spaces. So I think that that to have a kind of an ability to be fluid with these things is really important. So I was reading last night, in fact, I was reading some work by Florence Farr. So Florence Farr, member of the Golden Dawn, really important magician, and she would have defined herself as a magician. And that's really significant because when we tend to think of magicians, just like the second card in the Major Arcana, we tend to think of men. And in the same way that historically, when we speak of doctors, we have tended, by and large, to think of men as doctors and women as nurses. And I think as we kind of, you know, change our culture, change our ways of understanding gender, role, identity, magic, or practice reflects this as well. So this differentiation between, you know, all of these different people, firstly, when you look at it closely, it disappears because often these people are moving from space to space. They're often, you know, they're not, here I'm a druid. I'm never going to go anywhere near any of this other stuff, because people make friendships, people do ceremony together, you know, people find ways of sharing each other's practice. And I think the other thing is that having a kind of fluidity with this, you know, if you want to be a wizard, then that's completely fine. But if the teachings or the suggestions of the style of something like chaos magic are considered valuable, then one of the things is that we don't want to limit ourselves in a particular kind of a way. You know, we're magical practitioners, and we have gone by many, many names. As you mentioned, in academia, we talk about cunning folk or service magicians. You know, we have to designate the kind of the social role, like you were saying, Stephanie. So who are we doing magic for? What's the purpose behind that? But that's likely to be really variable again across an individual lifetime. Some of the rituals that we do, if you think of something like connecting with the spirit of the divine, however you understand that. Now, you can do that through a theurgic, classic magical ritual where you're invoking the spirit of a deity. If you happen to be drawing down the moon at a Sabbath, is that not the same thing? Is that not the same? I mean, the practice is basically the same. You are, you know, you're, but and there is a difference in the flavor, but the difference is like the difference in music. Whilst we may have our favorites and the things we return to again and again, it's good, I think, if you're interested in an art form, if you're interested in music, to listen to a wide range of material. You know, you'll be a richer and more informed and a person who just has this kind of an engagement, not just with only this style of music, but with music as a whole. We're interested in magic. We're interested in transformation affecting the world that we understand inside and outside of ourselves. And let's make sure that the words that we're using to describe ourselves in that practice are things that enable us rather than limit us to only certain things we are permitted to do.
That's it. We can close our channel now. All said and done.
I'm sure there's plenty more interesting things to say beyond me going on about stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it has this notion I value so much with you of openness and practicability, and yeah, and that's totally up my alley as well. So, and I'm sure up your alley as well, Stephanie. So, yeah, we can how do you say it? We concur in fluidity.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would like to share a picture that popped up in my head. There was a gathering of a druid and a witch and a magician and a wizard, and they talked to each other. And the witch said to the druid, "Oh, you do the same thing that I do. What do you call you a druid?" And the druid said, "Yes, and you have done the same things that I do, and you call yourself a witch." So that was the difference. That gathering.
There's a guy who wrote a book called Pagans and Christians a long time ago now, decades ago, a guy called Robin Lane Fox, who's professor of classics at Oxford University. And he talks about ancient paganism. And he says, what you have to understand about ancient paganism is ancient paganism is a belief system of cultic acts. So things people do. In the same way that if you talk about Hinduism is very much a kind of Western construct. There are people in, let's take India, who have a range of different beliefs and a range of different sacred texts and a range of different gods, goddesses, and spirits that they work with. But their practice as a group, as a community, looks really similar. So the idea that if you go to the British Isles and you go to a sacred spring and you see what are called clouties, which are kind of ribbons or offerings that have been tied onto the trees. Now, the people who've tied those ribbons, some of them will identify as pagans, and then within that, there might be witches, and there might be druids, there might be magicians and occultists and Thelemites and so on. And there'll also be people who just feel moved to honor the spirit of the spring in some way. And they see other people who've done this and they repeat the behavior. So what Robin Lane Fox is saying is that this isn't a religious movement which is about a particular text or a particular set of doctrines, but it is about a set of related behaviors, which I think is what you're talking about there, Stephanie. So it's like there are really, really similar things. So whether or not I create sacred space or open the temple or cast a circle, the process is the same in terms of what it's intended to do. There is some detail about how we get there, but most of it is pretty straightforward because we're humans. And so when we do magic, we do it in the way that humans do it. We would probably find it more confusing if we were talking to starfish about the way they do magic. They would have a very different view of the universe, I suspect.
Yeah, we as humans, storytelling species, and we are ritualistic species. So yeah, it has different flavors, but I think this notion of making music together, this is where, yeah, where it boils down to for me. If I go back, then where has the distinction begun? I mean, at the very, very first traces we have from human ritualistic behavior, you would not differentiate it, wouldn't you? This is just magical practice.
And I think that's the thing about all of this stuff is this is about a doing.
Yeah.
So you can, you know, there's that whole thing that comes up in chaos magic, but it appears in other traditions and styles as well. And in a number of kind of philosophical ideas about, you know, as human beings, we experience the world as discrete objects. You know, here are things, here is an object. And actually, most of the time, that way of describing the world is very helpful, but it's also fundamentally wrong. Everything is a continuous flow process. You know, here are the three of us, and we, you know, many of the atoms that we're made from, they're not the ones that we had 10 years ago, and they are continuously flowing and moving from the Big Bang and the ancient stars that exploded, creating carbon that we're made from, through into whatever comes next. So we can look at these objects, witch and wizard and so on, so these separate kind of concepts, but actually probably what's more interesting in a way and maybe more important is the flow and the relationship between these things. So part of the reason I've got so much stuff on my resume is because many of my friends are, you know, they're from these different traditions, but actually we've all done ceremony together, we've all worked magic together, we've been on pilgrimages together, we've hung out together. So the flow and the relationship between these things is what's really important, rather than the fixedness of them, because that's a convenient temporary illusion that we allow ourselves to have so that we can do things in the world. But it's not really how it works. And it's not the way that magic understands how it works either.
Perfect. So a witch, a goers, a mystic walk into a bar and they have a drink and they're good friends and change their hats and go out again and say, let's play this again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Julian, it was a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. Thank you for watching. What is your preferred role or your preferred expression of this form of magical practice? Let us know in the comments. And yeah, happy to see you again.
Lovely to see you. Thank you both very, very much. Most appreciated. Go well.
Bye-bye. The world is
Bye-bye.
magic.